Could I ask you to address your own question? Why is Deleuze not Lacan? Is it, for example, because of the influence of Hegel, where the influence of Nietzsche would be much more pronounced? Deleuze clearly the other Lacan, at least as again.
I guess what I would want to say is that probably the gap between Deleuze and Lacan has been exaggerated. At least in part it's exaggerated by Deleuze anyway. I mean, the thing about reading Deleuze is that when you read the comments on psychoanalysis, it seems that they want nothing to do with it. But then if you read Anti-Oedipus, you then also come across a number of passages where they attribute to Lacan a number of key conventions. So what you then actually get is a kind of, there is a Deleuzean Lacan, which is a Lacan not of all his kind of terrible acolytes who made a hash of the original Lacan and they totally misunderstood his project. So there is actually then another kind of Lacan to be thought about, what would be the Deleuzean Lacan. And I'm looking forward to the day when we can have this argument with Zizek, because this would be the ultimate way of coming back to Zizek to say, well, actually there's a Deleuzean Lacan. I think Zizek would kind of die at the thought of that one. I think the other point about the sort of relationship to Hegel, again, you have lots of people, commentators on Deleuze who say that Deleuze is absolutely doesn't have anything to do with Hegel, couldn't possibly. But I mean, that seems to me an absolute nonsense. I mean, Deleuze's supervisor was one of the great French Hegelians in Hippolyte, so he clearly has knowledge of it. The fact that he doesn't write about it specifically, I don't think is necessarily all that significant. And that he has a kind of running battle with the idea of the dialectic throughout his work is surely some kind of a reaction to that. But I think also the other part about Hegel, and this is what's surprising about Zizek's book, is that Zizek's stuff on Hegel brings out that which is the most Deleuzean, namely the kind of, the stuff that Zizek talks about, the idea of the night of the world, as a description of delirium, is very close to what Deleuze is actually interested in. So it would seem to me that there would probably be a Hegel that one could extract that is quite Deleuzean too, without wanting to say that Deleuze becomes Hegelian in any particular way.
I mean, one of the things you said about Lacan was that Deleuze is not a Lacanian because for Deleuze the dialectic is always open. That sounds like a strange reading of Lacan to me, in the sense that if Lacan is a Hegelian, he's not an idealist. The dialectic is always in play. He's not, the way that I read Lacan is not the way that Zizek, he's not the Lacan of Zizek, which is clearly a kind of different form of Hegelianism, or a different reading based on a different set of extracted notes from texts of Hegel. And it seemed to me that as we were talking, the Deleuze that you were narrating sounded much more to me like Hegel than it did Lacan. It seemed to me that Lacan, in the way that I read Lacan, is doing what you're narrating Deleuze does. Does that make sense to you? I don't think the Lacan that you kind of play off against this open-ended dialectic is the Lacan that I would read, because I wouldn't read Lacan as an idealist. And
I don't think I said an open-ended dialectic.
What you said was that in Lacan there's a kind of resolution that the subject lacks the other. I think first of all that's contestable. I don't think heterogeneity is the other depends on how we define the other. But my point, I suppose, is that the way that you narrate Deleuze in the talk makes him sound like a Hegelian idealist in a way that Lacan is not, except as represented by Zizek. The case you make for Deleuze not being a Lacanian seems to actually be the case for him being a Lacanian.
Okay. When I was talking about the relationship between the object at the R and the figure of other, I meant only that they are in a relationship of lack, and the object at the R is always a sort of the impossible completion. Yeah. I mean, I think that's fairly uncontroversial. Whereas what Deleuze is saying about the relationship between the two series is that they're not in a relationship of one lacking the other, or even an impossible completion of the other. That's not how they work, but rather what happens is that you get a kind of resonance And within film terms, what that means is something quite simple as just a repetition of a motif. I mean, Deleuze is quite attentive to that. If you think of a repetition of a motif within a film, then Deleuze is saying that creates a series which makes us look forward to the next repetition, and each one is modification, and that creates sense for us. So I think that's kind of the controversial part. The other part of your question, which is I think an extremely good question, there's two things that need to be said about it. First of all, the Logic of Sense was published in 1969, so that's still old Lacan. Okay, and that's still Lacan in his most Hegelian phase, so there would be no surprise if we're getting a kind of Hegelian Lacan coming out of that. Secondly, I think that the claim or the charge that Deleuze is potentially an idealist is a very serious one. I think that charge has probably some merit and would need to be thought about. I guess in my own way of thinking is that it's probably not quite the case that he's an idealist in a sort of bad sense, but certainly he is working with the idea of a kind of phenomenological ideal as being the necessary precondition to knowledge. And I think that there's a lot of work to be done in, I happen to have a Husserlian as a supervisor when I wrote my PhD. And, as far as he was concerned, I couldn't read enough Husserl in order to read Deleuze. And of course, at that time I thought he was wrong. But as Mark Twain says about parents, when you're 14 you think they're an idiot, and then when you get to 25 you're amazed at how much they've learned in the last 10 years. I'm having a similar feeling about my supervisor, and much to my chagrin I'm having to go back and read myself. So I think there's a lot more to be said about that.
Isn't there a sense of, sorry, just one more thing, isn't there a sense of idealism in the notion of excess in terms of the knowability, the pure thought, the kind of aestheticism of Hegel's dialectic?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, Deleuze is, in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says that the basis of thought is to come against the idea of the insensible, which is, it's translated as the imperceptible, but it's really the non-sense that he's trying to go after. He says that's really where sense is located, which is obviously an idealist proposition. In the sense that he can only conceive of the sense only as an ideal. It's the only way he can conceive of it. He can't conceive of it as an ideal, or it's concrete in its ideal form.
But isn't there a sense also in which excess is an encompassment of everything in what we know? In other words, there not being real beyond sense, which Lacan does retain.
No, I don't think so. That wouldn't make sense.
My idea of it.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's right. I think that Deleuze necessarily retained the formalism, so that the excess is always produced as a consequence of the formalism.
Are you sure in the notion of an ideal? Also fascinating. But just specifically on the notion of that, I suppose I was wondering who the supervisor was who told you should read more of this. I'm intrigued by that. But it strikes me that there are different ways in which the Husserlian notion of the ideal gets interpreted. Forget about what Husserl might know about. They're possible, as it were, materialist articulations of the Husserlian notion of the ideal, which would sit uneasily alongside the thought that there's some proximity between Husserl and the Hegel triumphant. But we don't necessarily have to read Husserl alongside the Hegel triumphant, or we don't have to think that Hegel is triumphant. We could have a materialised Hegel as well. So I was wondering how important it would be for you to align the Husserlian notion of ideality is somehow not material, not textual, not somehow.
The answer to the first question is simple. That's Horst Ruthrauff, who has written several books on language. And he has an essay in the collection I edited for South Atlantic Quarterly, which came out as a book called Deleuzean Century. There's an essay by Horst Ruthrauff in that, which says some of the things that I have been saying. I think the problem for us, of course, is that ideal in English means something quite different from what it means in German, and the sort of translation, it doesn't get translated. Once it gets into English, ideal sort of means something to do with politics and its kind of ideal world, and often gets denigrated with utopia and so forth. In its eidetic form, as it is in Husserl, I certainly agree with that. And in my book on Deleuzeism, the thing that pissed off most people was that I said that there was an eidetic core within what Deleuze is saying, that he is constantly trying to formulate the possibility of eidos as at the basis of a concept, but he's always saying that must be virtual, that we have to have a kind of virtual eidetic core, which is then always in a kind of relationship. And I said dialectical, but I don't think that's necessarily right. But I was trying to say something like dialectical with concrete actuality, that we need the virtual in order to apprehend the actual, and likewise the actual sort of needs the virtual in order for it to have sense.
So then the struggle is going to be to prevent the virtual actual distinction collapsing into an ideal material distinction. But
Right.
it seems to be the problem, isn't it, with the way in which a certain perception of Husserl
Yes.
has set up a certain conflicts about how to bring those relations, which forces it back into a discussion which doesn't seem to be all that helpful.
Yeah, and that's probably why Deleuzians themselves have been completely reluctant to even kind of wander down that pathway and investigate the question.
Would French Deleuzians be less reluctant? I was just thinking that maybe they have a rather less hard-bound version of Husserl.
I don't know. Husserl, the French don't seem to read Husserl. That doesn't seem to be their contact. I mean, maybe for nationalist reasons, I don't know, but Bergson seems to be much more interesting to them. So the French Deleuzians are much more attached to that particular connection.
If thought is stimulated by literature, in the example that you give, cinema, surely the body is engaged in the texture, in perceiving the texture and the affect of style. It's a bodily, it's a haptic with literature, it's a haptic kind of projection. And with cinema, it's obviously much more like moving across the screen, bodies moving in space. The embodied spectator, the brain is embodied, the brain is biological, thought is biological ultimately. So
certainly, if we follow the sort of logic of what we've been discussing already, the concept of life could not be bodily. It would have to be a concept. It would have to be a virtual concept by which we would understand the body. So, I mean, I think what Deleuze would say is that the body has to be both a concept, it has to be both virtual and actual, and therefore we then have this problem of what do we call the relationship between the virtual and the actual. Do we dare call it a dialectical relationship? No, because that will get you in trouble. So what then do we call it? Well, there are a number of other options. Abstract machine would be kind of my choice term, but then we have to rethink a whole bunch of other terms to get there.
yeah, ultimately style is affective and appeals to the sensorium, whether it's by projection or by direct stimulus.
Yes. Yeah. No, I would agree with that. I guess, just to sort of extemporise a little bit, what I realised as I was presenting this paper is that what I've been working on is this, it's a book that's going to be called Practical Deleuzeism. Not just because it's going to be a handbook sort of thing, but also coming from Deleuze's idea of practical philosophy. But I've kind of sort of managed to boil Deleuze down to three basic concepts. And then once you get down to these three concepts, you actually have a matrix that you can work with. And a lot of what I was saying here probably only makes sense if you were inside my head and could see what those three concepts were and how they stitch together. But basically, Deleuze has three concepts. You have the body without organs, you have the abstract machine, and the assemblage. Now, the way these three concepts stitch together is that body without organs is presupposition. The simplest definition of the body without organs is presupposition. It's that which you must presuppose in order to be able to think. So that's the body without organs. Now, the assemblage is the concrete reality that you are then going to think about. How then do you think the relationship between presupposition and concrete reality? Well, that's what the abstract machine is. So you can actually boil it down to something as kind of simple as that, which is also then has its own kind of complexity. And that was really the reason why I was going back to reading the logic of sense. If you follow the logic of sense and you read Deleuze's definition of sense, what I came to realise and came to sort of find to be quite compelling is that the abstract machine, you can scrub out abstract machine and write in the word sense, and then 1,000 Plateaus it changes how you read it, but it works extremely well. Writing the word sense for abstract machine, And you see that that's really what he's trying to say. The sense is always absent from the object. It can never be present in the thing itself, and yet without it, you can't make sense of it. And that's what the abstract machine is. The abstract machine is never in the thing itself, but it's always kind of hovering over and above it, drawing its diagram, in other words, giving it its sense. So that's kind of where I've been going, and it's sort of behind what I was saying today, although they told me this is an English research institute, so I duly dragged out the literature stuff and did that. Maybe I shouldn't have left all the literature stuff at home and talked about philosophy instead.
So it's Husserl's notion of sense.
Yes, yeah, it's very much there. My supervisor was right, God damn it.
Doesn't sense have another meaning in French associated with direction? I was trying to tie this up with vertigo and the inexorable sense of fate to that film, the gravity of the movement towards the void, if you think of the vertigo at the end. But of course Madeline was an interesting name in terms of your references to Proust, which takes us to Nietzsche's notion of the eternal recurrence here. And I think there might be something here about the overman as well. Nietzsche and Deleuze's efforts to rework and rethink the notions of the Übermensch or the overman, and particularly how he relates that to Foucault's work as well is interesting. But in terms of the dialectic, I'm surprised you didn't pick up on the spiral that is very, very central to the film Vertigo. You get that in, I think, from tree trunks through to staircases, through to camera trickery. I mean, it's everywhere. You can't escape that. It doesn't seem, you can't escape it, but what is the escape from it apart from death or the co-implication of death and life there?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's luckily...
What lives on in other words?
Lucky for you, it did escape me. Otherwise we would have been here and still be going. But, I mean, thank you for that. I need to rewatch the film as soon as I finish unpacking all the boxes and find it. And I figure out how to work UK television and so forth. But yes, you're right. Sense, as in song, does mean direction as well as meaning. And Deleuze also says that sense is fated. He explicitly says that in the logical sense, that sense is fated. And that's why I was reading the Lévi-Strauss and Robinson paradox, and what he's saying is that the sense of something, it's fated to be meaningful. If it wasn't fated to be meaningful, it would never mean anything. But nonetheless, it may not mean anything, so its fate may not be realised. And that's sort of what I was trying to play with the idea of the coincidence of that must occur, but it may not occur, and we have to hold a suspension between those two things. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot more there that I haven't said, and I certainly think there'll be a lot more that you could play with.
I mean, for me, the test of thought that Nietzsche poses in the logical sense is, can you accept the possibility that chance and determinism are the same? And then that would raise, I think, a set of interesting questions about Hegel, about the dialectic.
Well, Deleuze certainly says that in his Nietzsche book. He explicitly says you can't have chance without determination. It's only determination, only by reading the two things together that they actually mean anything at all. So yes, that's clearly there.
But what happens if they flip over?
Well, I think they would have to constantly, wouldn't they, in order for them to be...
So maybe the word you're looking for is penumbral, which is Husserlian.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, and you certainly do have that within Deleuze as a kind of, he talks about an atmosphere of meaning and the shadow of sense. And so you have a lot of these metaphors there as well.
Bergson's model or concept of Elan Vital permeates most of Deleuze's thinking work. Surely that is... I mean, obviously, it's been unfashionable for a long time, partly because it apparently is biological essentialism. But surely it is biological. Elan Vital has to be. That the force that impels becoming Elan Vital is a life force. It's a force of living. Living has to be in my biological.
Well, sure, but I mean, the strictest translation of Elan Vital would not necessarily mention body. I mean, as you yourself translated it as either life force or spirit of life and so forth. So we don't necessarily get to body. Plus, Deleuze also does, unhelpfully enough, talk about an inorganic form of life. So he is quite obviously wanting us to separate life from the body strictly. I mean, he wants life to be something... For him, life is creativity. Otherwise, how could you have an inorganic form of life? So I think that if we keep tying it to the body, if we tie it to a sort of the life within the body and with biology, then I think that we're missing what is radical about what Deleuze is trying to say.
But it has to also be embodied.
Well, it's not excluded from that. Yeah, no, of course not. It's not excluded from that, but it doesn't begin there and it doesn't end there. And he wants to, I would say, he wants to separate the idea of life. And that's why he chooses that particular example of, life is between birth and, between the living and the dying, but it's in neither place. Well, you can also then say what counts as his life doesn't exist there, it exists in the minds of the people who are looking at it, and it's actually conceptual.
But the encounter with the artwork is partly sensorial. Has to be.
Oh yeah, and that's not, but I think we're confusing issues here. I mean, I don't think that a definition of life needs to have a definition, or needs to be attached to the body. I mean, certainly that's not what Deleuze is saying. But that doesn't preclude us from saying that the relationship that we have with an art object can't impact on the body, because clearly it does. So I don't think that these positions are mutually exclusive. Yeah.
I just wondered whether what place the real has in Deleuze. Which is kind of what I was asking, we're trying to talk about earlier, but what Anna just said reminded me of Lyotard's question, can thought go on without a body? What's Deleuze's position on that?
Well, I guess the glib answer is that he, in choosing the Rogue Riderhood example, was kind of conscious of the fact that thought would go on after he had disappeared, and he was having a kind of last laugh at us. As for what he says about the real, well, in Anti-Oedipus he's very explicit. I mean, what he does with Lacan is to say, and with Lacanian psychoanalysis particularly, is to say that there is no real distinction between the symbolic and the imaginary, and that both of those things exist within the real. So Deleuze falls in favour of the real. And if you go to, which I haven't done a lot, but if you go to the original French, you then have some very strange passages where he talks about what we translate as either it's the réalité réelle. So it's either the really real or the reality that is real. But you have these tautologies that kind of get glossed out of the English translation. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it just looked too weird. But so he's obviously very concerned that he's putting forward an idea of reality. And this is the point about, I probably didn't talk about this, but anyway, delirium. What he wants to say about delirium is that the delirium feels real to the people who are experiencing it, even if they know that it is not the really real.
But isn't the body real?
But that would be the problem, right? I mean, yes, it's real, but only real in that analytic sense, not real as in some final determination. Otherwise, the kind of description that you get of the wolfman, thinking, is the wolfman becoming a wolf? He knows he's not growing hair or fangs or whatever, but nonetheless his body feels as though it's becoming wolf. Now, how can we understand that? His feelings are real to him, but they're not real in the sense that we can look at his body and say objectively, well, look, buddy, you're not becoming a wolf.
But the body is real in the sense that it dies, and my intellect has no control, has no...
Yeah, but that wouldn't be our definition of real, because otherwise a table couldn't be real, because that's not going to live or die. So our definition of real can't have anything to do with life. The real must be exceptional.
But can't you say what Anna was saying, which is that life must have something to do with the body, and the body must have something to do with something which is beyond sense-making processes? In other words, it's always going to be the real, in terms of organic, is always going to be in excess of thought. Systems of thinking.
I think Deleuze is saying that life is always in excess of thought, but he doesn't attach that to the living or to the body, and he then gives us a very radical form of life. As I said, it's the inorganic form of life, so he wants to put there any form of creativity to equal life, regardless of whether or not it is actually living or biological. So I think we can detach it. I don't agree that it must be the living, and I certainly don't agree that the real must be living, because as I said, the table is real and it's got nothing to do with life.
thinking about Ahab becoming whale. Ahab physically becomes whale, just as whale physically becomes Ahab. Whale swallowed and digested Ahab's leg, and Ahab's harpoon pierces the whale's body. They do physically become each other in a literal sense, and in some ways, for me, when Deleuze comes across a literal expression in art of a particular component, diagrammatic component, then that's the trigger for his concept. So the spiral and vertigo is both. It's a real biological spiral, Madeleine's hairstyle. It's a mental spiral. It's a spiral staircase, the real object, actual object. And I think they're very, very closely intermeshed. And they have to be. One can't be moved away from the other. It's not possible.
Well, I mean, Deleuze clearly doesn't. I would say Deleuze doesn't agree with that. That life is clearly separate from the living, and that's the whole point of it. And that's what makes his definition of life radical and challenging, is to separate the concept of life from the biological living.
But why does he always use, not always, but often use aesthetic expressions, manifestations, to think? The manifestations are necessary to think. As a stimulus to, not just as a stimulus to thought, but they're intimately linked with the thought itself and the shape of the thought, the force of the thought.
Yeah, I guess the way to answer this is he says in Cinema 1 that the camera is the consciousness of the film. Okay? Now, that is an anthropomorphization, if you like. So, but he's not saying that the camera is alive. He says the camera is the consciousness of the film. Now, this is the Husserlian legacy that is in Deleuze. He is very much a phenomenologist. What you perceive, what you see, what you feel, that is the real. Now, that's why he can use the aesthetic criteria, because those things are real, however imagined they are real to whoever encounters them. So he doesn't need to tie it to the sort of literal bodily truth, because it's not necessarily important to him. And certainly the example of Ahab, the relationship between the two has really, the fact that the whale took his leg is in some respects, that just starts it off, but that's not the basis of the relationship. The relationship is clearly more involved than that, and is mental and so on.
Yeah, but it's a physical rapport focused on whiteness, the white wall. Now, white, and to go back to your cinematic example of the camera moving through space, white is a physical property. It's also something else, but it's a physical. It's something. It's a percept and an affect. And the camera moving through space is also an affective. In that, it enters the physical eye, and to me the eye is an extension of the brain, literal extension of the brain. That which goes into the body belongs to the brain, because the brain isn't just stuck in the head. Obviously, the body without organs, it's a more fluid model. So it's intimately connected with its stimulus in the environment. I would say thought has to be ultimately intimately connected with its stimulus, whatever that stimulus is. It has to be ultimately connected.
Yeah, but I think we're talking cross purposes, because it's, it would be ludicrous to challenge the idea that your eyes are connected to your body and that you receive stimulus from that and that somehow has a bodily effect. I'm certainly not challenging that. All I'm saying is that Deleuze's concept of life does not depend upon that for its definition. And I don't think that's challengeable. I think if you read that passage very closely, you will see that that's precisely what he's saying. Otherwise, you could not have inorganic life. It would make no sense otherwise.
Why do you think that's revolutionary? Why do you think that's radical? Because I can think of an argument that could be the opposite, could state the opposite. Which is to say that, just to say that, you're talking in idealist, you're talking in terms of an idealism, and that retaining distinction, a rigorous distinction between the real and reality could be a far more progressive, could be a far more progressive set of concepts than what I'm reading as a kind of idealism as the way to understand.
Well, I guess my response would simply be that it is radical, it's conceptually radical, and to separate life from living. I mean, that's just the thought experiment that is obviously conceptually radical. Whether or not that is politically radical is a different question, and not one that I really addressed at any great length here. And certainly, I don't want to offer a ready-made answer to that question. The part about what I was trying to get at that does refer to politics is the idea that truth is simply out there, but rather what I'm interested in is a kind of politics that challenges the idea of received truth. And Deleuze is saying that truth is not simply out there. We don't have a love of truth. We have to be made to see the truth. So I guess my interest in the politics is to do with a kind of politics of rhetoric that gets, like as I said at the very start, how can I go to a meeting for a journal that wants to write, a journal whose platform is explicitly to write about politics, and for them to look aghast at me that I should mention the war? I mean, how is that possible? It's just completely dumbfounded me. So I'm very interested in the way in which, the truth of the war in Iraq, for instance, seems not to have much of an effect on most people. So I think that's sort of what I would take from Deleuze, is that he's saying people don't love the truth. The truth we have to be made, violently made. And in this sense, one can hear the sort of echo of Gramsci, that we must, violently, and, of course, but Zizek, Zizek only pretends to be anti-Deleuze. He also steals lots from Deleuze, and then, and then in his own, sort of ressentiment fashion, then says, Deleuze is all bad and so forth. So that's why I think there is, much need for there to be a proper encounter between Deleuze and Zizek. I mean, if you talk to Zizek privately, it's quite different what he says, on stage. On stage, he rants and raves about, Deleuze, but privately, he's sort of sitting at dinner with him and says, oh yeah, I took that from Deleuze, and yeah. So, but, pretty honest. He also says that, there's that sort of Russell paradox of, all Zizeks are liars, and I'm Zizek.
Yes.